Okay, well,
Don't touch that board.
don't touch them.
Oh, don't touch the board.
Don't
Okay.
touch the board, it's a smart board.
It will start
Smart,
doing all
okay.
sorts of things,
Yeah.
right.
Thanks for the
It's a
timing.
Smart
Well, I
board.
want to welcome everyone to the first in our series of candidate lectures for the Leon Robertson Faculty Development Chair in Injury Prevention. And we're just so happy to have here, giving the first of those lectures, Dr. Maria Bulzaccheli. Maria is known to many of you, having earned her doctoral degree from our school and department in 2007. Before that, she was a graduate of Boyden College. Did I pronounce that right?
Bowdoin College.
Bowdoin is better. Okay, thank you. And before coming to Hopkins, she was a researcher at both Mass General and the Harvard School of Public Health. After leaving,
Taking me back. No.
pardon me?
Really taking me back. Okay.
After leaving Hopkins, she went to the University of Massachusetts to be an assistant professor, where her work has primarily focused on occupational safety and the prevention of occupational injuries. She's been funded by the U.S. Army, by NIOSH, and has published on a wide variety of topics, and we're going to be fortunate enough to hear today about OSHA enforcement of safety in the U.S. tree care industry. And I was Maria's advisor, so it's a double pleasure for me
That's
to
right.
invite
Thank
Maria
you, Jan.
back.
I owe a lot to Jan, and many of you sitting here. You all really helped. So I am going to talk about OSHA enforcement safety in the tree care industry. Before I get going, I have to thank a couple of people. Alex Julius, who was a student at UMass when we were analyzing the data, or collecting the data for this, and Brian Kane, also at UMass. These are the real tree care folks. These are the folks who climb the trees and know what they're doing. So when we talk about tree care work, this is the kind of thing we're talking about: pruning, bracing, removal of trees, trimming around utility lines. You've probably seen this going on, if not in your own backyard, then maybe along the roadway. And so this is very dangerous work. The hazards include things like falling from the tree or from a bucket truck, being struck by a tree or a branch, getting electrocuted, and contact with machinery. So to illustrate some of these hazards, I think it's best to just look. This is what we're talking about. You're up in the tree, you're being supported largely by ropes. You're working with a saw. It's, unfortunately too common that sometimes you'll cut through the rope and you'll fall out of the tree. So you're up very high, and so falls are a big issue here. I like this picture because it illustrates just how massive trees are, right? If you don't get up close to them, sometimes you forget. They're just really massive things. And so when you're cutting them down and making them fall, if they don't fall in exactly the right place, people will get hurt. So, and then of course, once everything's down on the ground and they run it through a chipper, these machines are just, unforgiving, right? I mean, you can put a whole log through one of these things. So it really, a person doesn't make the blade stop spinning. So lots and lots of hazards in this industry. So naturally you have much higher fatality rates than in, say, the overall workforce. These numbers are actually for the sort of new category of tree care and landscaping, which is now all together. And so I think if you were to take out just the tree care injuries, the rate would probably be higher than 14 deaths per 100,000 workers, but this is the best data we have right now. So you can see it's many times higher than the rate of 4 for overall for workers. The difference in non-fatal injuries is not as great, still higher in tree care, but again, I think this is because so many of these injuries are fatal, right? I mean, you fall out of the tree, good chance you'll die from that. So I'm going to show some trends over time, and I have to do this in 2 different time series because after 2002, the CFOI, the Census of Fatal Occupational Injuries, started using a different classification system. So prior to 2003, tree care industry had a standard industrial classification code, and that's how things were coded. After that, we switched to the North American industry classification system, and so tree care actually used to be a standalone industry under the SIC system, and in the NAICS system, it's lumped in with landscaping. So if you're really interested in the tree care work, now after, from 2003 on, it's very hard to pull that out from landscaping. So up to 2002, you can see a general increase in tree care fatalities in the U.S., from around 40 in the earlier days up to closer to 70, 80 around 2002. One trend here is that Hispanic workers have become an increasing percentage of the workers killed in the tree care industry. So this chart shows Hispanic workers as a percentage of deaths. And so that up at 2002, they're around 25% of the fatalities were Hispanic workers. So this is an industry, not only is it hazardous, but when you think about vulnerable populations, here is an industry that we really need to take a look at to protect workers. So in the next series, this actually starts again at earlier, 1992. But if we just look at where we left off in the other chart, you can see the number has sort of leveled off or maybe even decreased. And again, the percentage, oh, I'm sorry, I touched the thing. You were right. The percentage of fatalities that are Hispanics is has increased over this time period for about 10% to 25% or so, or even a little more. So again, this is an industry, lots of vulnerable groups make up a large proportion of the fatalities here. This graph just, this is actually tree care workers in any industry, again, because after 2003, it's hard to pull out just the tree care industry ones. So typically, in these fatal incidents, workers are trimming or pruning, which makes sense because then they're usually up high, or felling, knocking down a tree, right? So it's falling, and then to a lesser extent, clearing or operating machinery, things like that. So in terms of the causes of death, in about a third of the fatalities, it's a fall, okay? And then about a quarter of them, it's being struck by something, and that could be a tree limb or maybe even a tool that falls. And then a good chunk of these, 18%, are electrocutions. And sometimes this is direct contact with the power line, but sometimes it's either a bucket truck or even a tree limb that contacts the power line. And so electrocution is a big issue here, as well as transportation incidents. Sometimes workers are working along the roadway and actually are struck by a vehicle, or sometimes one of the vehicles they're riding in crashes or overturns, and so transportation is another big one. And then you can see chippers have their own category here, 7%. So what are people doing to try to prevent these kinds of injuries? I'll go into a little bit more detail on each of these. First of all, the American National Standards Institute does have a standard, the Z133.1, that pertains to tree care. There are various OSHA standards that apply. There's industry certification and accreditation, and then licensing. Not a lot of states do this, but some states do require arborists to be licensed. So let's look at certification and accreditation first. You've got a few associations that do this. The Tree Care Industry Association offers an accreditation. So a tree care company can become accredited by meeting certain criteria, and this involves some demonstration of knowledge of proper tree care practices, having certified arborists on staff, and a certain proportion of the staff has to have certification. The International Society of Arboriculture offers a certification, so this would be for an individual arborist. You can go and get certified. Some states also offer their own certification. Now, a couple things to keep in mind here. This is entirely voluntary, right? So, it's for people who want to do this. And safety is only one component of the accreditation or certification. Mainly, it's focused on making sure you know what you're doing in terms of tree maintenance, right? And so safety is one component, but only one component of those. And then the ANSI standard really provides guidelines for all sorts of things: chainsaw, chipper, and aerial lift safety, use of personal protective equipment, setting up your work site. You need to establish a perimeter so that people, don't walk into your work area, or you're not hit by a passing vehicle, and standards for climbing. So this is a consensus standard, right? Which means it's not mandatory. It's revised every 6 years. The most recent revision was in 2012. Feel free to ask questions, by the way, as I go along. There's no reason to sit with a question. Yes, Renee?
I'm sure you said this before. Sorry, I was a couple of minutes late. So if my wife and I go out in the backyard without helmets and with a big chainsaw and to take down a tree and we die, it could happen. That's not included in that 1,200 number, right?
Well, in the 1,200 number, so that would be CFOI, so those would be occupational injuries. So if you're just doing it at home yourself, it wouldn't really be considered an occupational injury.
Do you have a sense about, has anyone looked at it's tree care, right? Are there a lot of people dying of tree care injuries that are simply not being counted there because they're kind of, doing it non-occupationally? It's still the same task, right? Right,
it is, and so obviously the risks are the same. I don't really know the numbers, honestly, but you're right, absolutely. Anecdotally, I know of several instances in which, non-arborists have cut down their own trees.
Right.
So it does happen, yeah, absolutely. Do you have a question, or?
No, I was just thinking it would be very unlikely that us guys in this room would be doing that kind of work where you have, logs as big as that podium and you have to climb up stuff. But if you and your wife are good at that,
My wife is a little unusual, I think.
So in an earlier study, my colleagues up at UMass and I looked at compliance with the ANSI standard among arborists in New England. And we did this really trying to compare accredited tree care companies with non-accredited companies that had a certified arborist on staff, and then those companies that had neither accreditation nor a certified arborist. And so Alex went out and directly observed tree care crews on job sites all around southern New England, and basically had a checklist of the ANSI guidelines, and yes, they're complying with that, no, they're not complying with that one. And overall, all the companies and all of the observations, about 64% compliance was found. So I don't know if you think that's a lot or a little. There's lots of room for improvement there. Compliance did vary by accreditation or certification status. So the accredited companies, it was 72% compliance, certified 70%. There's no statistical difference between those two groups, but those were both statistically higher than the non-accredited, non-certified arborists, which their compliance was about 51%. So again, accreditation and certification are voluntary. So is it the safety conscious workers who go and seek that? We're not really saying accreditation and certification make people safer, but it is an indication that it doesn't have to be around 51% compliance, right? It can be much higher. And that even among certified and accredited companies, there's room, right? There's room to improve safety there as well. So, what's OSHA doing? This project that I'm talking about today really came about because this caught my eye. In 2008, OSHA actually published an advance notice of proposed rulemaking for tree care operations. They would have basically adopted the ANSI standard as mandatory OSHA regulation, right? But in 2010, the proposed rule was withdrawn. So currently, there is no comprehensive OSHA standard specifically for the tree care industry. Now, there are other OSHA regulations that apply. So there's personal protective equipment regulations, there's working around electrical utilities regulations, so those apply. So in this study, this made me ask these questions. Oh, yes, question. Jan first.
Do you know why the standard was withdrawn?
I don't know why. And so I've read things like the testimony, NIOSH, of course, gave testimony for this process, and basically, there were a few issues, but it didn't seem like any that would say, don't do this, don't
NIOSH
proceed.
support it.
NIOSH, so the issues identified were kind of like I mentioned earlier. People do tree care work outside of the tree care industry, so one thing is they said, well, if you're going to make a standard like this, it should cover all tree care workers and not just those in the tree care industry. But that seems doable, right? OSHA should be able to make a standard that covers them. So I'm not sure why it was withdrawn, but this really just made me curious. Keisha had a hand, and then back to
I had the
Jackie.
same question.
Same question? Okay, Jackie.
So, is it possible those organizations you showed us were opposed to it? Because the usual cry is, this will cost us more money, therefore we oppose a standard.
Right, so I don't know that they oppose it. I'm not sure that the industry associations, in this case, would have, because these two associations are the ones that offer the accreditation and the certification. Yeah, I'm not
And it
sure
could
that
be part of the standard to say you must be certified.
Right, it could be good for them, sure.
Yeah.
So this made me ask this question. In general, I said, well, how does OSHA enforce safety in the tree care industry? I wanted to learn more about that. And so the specific question for this study I'm talking about today, specific objective was to identify the standards cited by OSHA, given that a fatality has occurred in the tree care industry and presumably a hazard existed, right? So something serious enough went wrong that someone died. What does OSHA do in those cases? So we looked at OSHA data from the Integrated Management Information System. From that system, you can obtain fatality investigation reports. And this is all just publicly available from OSHA's website, which is great. So we searched for reports based on the SIC code for the technical name for it is Ornamental Shrub and Tree Services Industry. So essentially looking for the tree care industry fatalities. And we took basically all of the incidents that occurred that we could get our hands on. So going back to '84 when this started, up to 2010 was the year that had the, when we actually pulled the data. That was the most recent year that the reports were available. There's always a little bit of lag time between when they occur and when they're available. So from these reports, we pulled out things about the event. Okay, so when did it happen, the date, the location, the employer, and the scope of inspection. So sometimes, and I want to learn more about this, but sometimes OSHA does a complete inspection. Sometimes they do what's called a partial inspection. In some cases, they actually don't do an inspection as part of these investigations. The reports provide citation information. So how many violations, if any, were given and what standards were cited specifically, and then any penalties in terms of dollar amounts that went along with that. And then from the narrative text portion of these reports, which is just a description of the incident, I should give the credit to Alex here. Alex coded the activity, the nature and mechanism of injury, and the precipitating factors. So from there, pretty simple analysis, but I hope you'll agree, kind of enlightening. Just descriptive analysis of the standards cited, causes of death by citation status, and citations by year. Now, I want to talk about these limitations right here because there's a few things just to keep in mind. The OSHA IMIS dataset does not capture all fatalities. So, as Renan pointed out, not only would they not go and investigate if this was a non-work-related fatality, even some work-related fatalities might be either outside of their jurisdiction or if you're, say, self-employed, and not really covered by the OSHA standards, you might not actually end up in the IMIS database. I did a quick check to see of the, I think it was 637 fatalities between 1992 and 2002 identified in a previous study. I went to IMIS and just put in those dates, and I think it was 300 something came up. So there's, a big chunk of these do not get investigated by OSHA. Again, this industry code doesn't capture all tree care workers. And there's really no denominator data, so I can't look at rates here. Again, part of this is because of the industry coding issue, but part of it is no one really knows how many tree care workers there are. So it's, you know, the numbers are, there's not great information there. Coding of the narratives is, oh, yeah.
Any reason to believe across time that your denominator has changed significantly?
I believe that it could have. I don't know which direction it would have gone in.
Well, that was my next question.
Okay. All right. And so I'm working on an assumption here that, you know, because a fatality happened, that there was probably some violation, and that could be incorrect, right? It could be that OSHA doesn't, you know, give a citation because technically there was no violation of a standard. But that is what I'm interested in here. Do we have standards that cover enough of these scenarios, you know, for OSHA to be effective here? So from our search, and I should mention, I may have not mentioned this, the OSHA data, they still classify things using the SIC system even after 2003. So this is why we were able to pull out just the tree care industry from the OSHA data, which is really great. So we got 812 incidents total. Some of those hadn't closed yet, so I just pulled them out. And of the 767 that were just closed cases, 443 were federal OSHA investigations, 324 were done by the various state OSHAs. So this analysis focuses on those 443 federal OSHA investigations. I mean, the reasoning here is I wanted to learn about enforcement. You know, states can have their own regulations, and so this I'd like to look at that someday, but that's, you know, sort of opening a can of worms, I think. So focusing on these federal investigations, 65% of them resulted in at least one citation. This means that a whopping 35% actually resulted in no citation from OSHA. So somebody died and, you know, the employer wasn't cited for any violations. I wanted to see if this was maybe because the inspections weren't done. It turns out only 25 of these were, you know, inspections were not done. Maybe that had something to do with them not being able to give a citation for not having enough information. I don't know. But that still means, you know, 130 where there was no citation. They, you know, they did the inspection and there was still no citation. So I wanted to break things down in a, you know, look at it in a few different ways to try to see maybe what's going on there, and that's what I'll show you today. Overall, there were 64 different standards cited, and there were 909 total citations. So on average, there were around two citations per incident. And the maximum was, in one case, there were 19 things cited. Now, I will say some of these are related. So, for example, the personal protective equipment regulation is written in such a way that you have, you know, head protection, you know, is different from other kind of protection. And so, technically, you might have 3 personal protective equipment citations in one incident, but they each get counted differently. So that's why I think, you know, there's 64. It sounds like a lot, but some of them are related to one another. Yes?
Were all of these in federal program, state?
Yes,
and,
these
state
443
programs?
were in the federal, right? So this is excluding those 300 plus that were done by the state-approved plans.
So it really ends up being specific to a set of states.
Mm-hmm. But it's about half the states have their own plans and the other half federal OSHA
It
does.
would probably also include, I know for instance in Maryland, if anything happens to a federal employee or on federal property, Maryland OSHA doesn't look at it, the feds come in and look at it. So it could include that too.
Oh, yeah, it could include that.
And it flips back and forth because other states, the state plan does the public employees, right?
That's true. There's a handful of states
Yeah.
that are like that. So this is just to illustrate the number of citations. Again, it was 155 where there was no citation given. And then you can see that in most cases there's either 1 or 2 or 3, you know, very typical sort of count data in terms of the distribution. You know, very few had more than, you know, 5, 6, 7. So what were the standards cited? So actually, looking again, breaking apart all of the individual standards, so personal protective equipment appears a couple times in this chart. Overall, the number one standard cited was actually not a standard, it was the general duty clause. So the general duty clause is actually written into the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, and it says, employers must provide a workplace free from recognized hazards. So this is really a catch-all, right? There might not be a specific standard that says you must do this or you can't do this, but if OSHA thinks that a recognized hazard was present, they can give a citation based on the general duty clause. And so it looks like they rely on that quite a bit, right? More than a quarter of the time they're giving citation based on the general duty clause. And then other common ones, logging operations, some of that applies to tree care. Hazard communication, this is a more general standard. And then again, personal protective equipment. Here, there's general requirements. We have next vehicle-mounted elevating and rotating work platforms. And then electrical selection and use of work practices, electric power generation, transmission, and distribution. PPE for head protection. This one I was surprised by, recording criteria for needle stick and sharp injuries, but I guess technically if you're cut by a saw, maybe they consider that a sharp injury. I don't know. And my favorite, lockout tagout standard, right? Medical services and first aid, more PPE, eye and face protection here. Reporting fatalities and multiple hospitalization incidents to OSHA, more electrical training. And then posting of notice of problems, that's another general one. Employers are supposed to post, you have rights and here's what you do if you think your rights are being violated, So these are the standards they're citing when they do actually give citations. When you combine the PPE categories all together, that really comes out to the most. And then electrical, followed by general duty clause. So I wanted to see, in terms of the causes, we went and coded the incidents, and so, how did the fatality occur? What was the cause of death? First, looking at just these broad categories that were used in prior studies, falls, electrocutions. These proportions are very similar to the pie chart I showed you a few moments ago. So I think, these fatalities are probably somewhat representative of, all of the fatalities. So the most common thing is to fall, and you might be falling from a tree, or you might be falling with the tree. You might fall out of an aerial lift. So that's the most common, followed by electrocution, and then being struck by a falling tree or branch. Now I wanted to see, by cause of death, how many of these were cited and how many of these were not cited, right? And so here's an interesting thing, right? The bar represents the total number, so 131 fall incidents. 68 were cited, 63 were not cited. So almost half of the falls, someone died in the fall, were not cited, right? OSHA did not cite the employer in almost half of these cases. It looks like with electrocutions, 3/4 of the time, a citation does result. Struck by a falling tree or branch, again, a big chunk of these, citation does result. So there are differences here in terms of how OSHA is enforcing safety depending on what happened. And it's kind of troubling to see that so many of the falls, which is the number one cause of death for these folks, often just does not result in a citation. So what's going on there? I wanted to look at some more specific cause of death. So breaking down those falls to, falling from a tree or falling from equipment, and this is how the distribution looks. When you look at the very specific cause of death, about a fifth of them are struck by a falling tree or branch. But, again, falling overall is largest, and we break it down. 16% of the time it's falling from or with a tree that's coming down, or falling from equipment, and usually that's an aerial lift. There were a couple where someone fell off a rooftop, but mostly it's an aerial lift or a bucket truck. And then energized equipment or a tree branch touching a line versus direct contact. Usually it's indirect contact through the tree or through a piece of equipment. But 10% direct contact with the power line, that's a lot. You think, how do they not see the power line there? You have to remember, a lot of these are trimming trees around the power lines, right? You see when they go out and do that up and down the road. So, I mean, it is there. It's a hazard, but again, we look here at the specific causes. When you fall out of a tree specifically, it's even more than half that are not cited, right? So what is it about falling out of a tree that OSHA comes and says, yeah, everything looks okay here. Sorry about the fatality, but there's nothing we can really do. That's definitely a question for future research. Yes.
But I'm going to ask it now.
Okay.
Did you read the narratives? Or were there narrative statements associated with these data?
So there are a couple of kinds of narrative. There's narrative description of the incident,
Right.
and occasionally there is some narrative from OSHA, and I haven't looked. I mean, in terms of the standards cited.
Anecdotally, do you have any flavor for what's going on when OSHA doesn't cite?
I don't. I thought of all different things. So first I thought, well, maybe some of these are self-employed individuals, and OSHA comes, but since they're self-employed, there's nothing to cite. I called OSHA and I said, do you go and investigate when there's a self-employed individual? And they said, we go and investigate anything that's reported to us. So I guess it's possible that there could be a self-employed individual killed and somebody reports it to OSHA and OSHA goes and investigates. But the question is, who would report that, right? If it's just me and my chainsaw, who's going to report that, that I was killed on the job and OSHA should come and investigate? And this is actually what made me look to see what proportion of incidents in CFOI actually made it into the IMIS database. And when I saw that, because about a third of fatalities overall are to self-employed individuals in the tree care industry, and it was actually much more than a third of incidents did not make it into IMIS. So,
But can you imagine a kind of incident where someone dies and OSHA could quite reasonably investigate and say, well, this is no one's fault?
so
Well, weather, for example, unexpected lightning strike, or weather had weakened the root system of the tree in a way that they shouldn't have been expected to notice. I'm just making.
I suppose it's possible, right? It is possible. And I'm not. I guess I'm not saying OSHA's been negligent in all these cases, right? But I am saying this is an awful lot of instances for no citation to result when. We know there are practices, again, if you look at the ANSI standard, there are practices that you're supposed to be following if you're climbing the tree and, cutting branches and things. So, can you say sometimes you just fall out of the tree and nothing, there was no specific hazard or no situation where people were not doing the right thing? Yeah, I mean, it's possible.
Thank you.
Yes.
Maria, I'm curious, I'm listening to you thinking back about the narrative text analysis we did with some Army data, and one of the things that they had was a code about fault, right? So they called it quote unquote accident or human factors or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
When OSHA goes out to do investigation, is there a field that is filled out after that says, human factors or accident, whatever it says? And if so, I'm just wondering, does that relate to cites, whether or not a citation is issued? Do you have that variable, or is it?
There's no field that says that.
Okay.
Jackie first and then back to Renee.
Did you have any sense or any way to detect whether or not the citations had been argued down? Because they're often negotiated from here to here or just away. And what I'm thinking is that some types of facilities or some types of organizations may have more negotiating power.
You're absolutely right, and actually these are all initial citations, so this would be before they had a chance to argue about it. So, because I did look at that, and I haven't looked at the penalty amounts yet, but I have initial penalty and then final penalty. So I will be able to see in the future how many and by how much they were knocked down. Haven't looked at it yet, but it's on my list of
And then look
things
at
I
the
think.
characteristics of the companies that were able to do that, who were
Right,
successful.
So these are, and there's actually, so it is interesting, there is a field that says violations. And then there's of course what standards are cited. And when you look at the number of that have violations, initial violations, it's actually slightly higher than the 443. It's more like 448. Now I'm not really sure what it is with those 4 cases that had a violation. The violation field was checked, but then there was no standard cited. So I dropped those 4 from this analysis because I don't know how how you could expect to do anything with that.
So I have a question, I think it's similar, and maybe it's just too basic. The citations, who do they go to? Because when I look at the category of falling from a tree, what I suspect is happening, one of the major causes would be that you have incorrectly put on the equipment that would protect you from falling. I suspect that would be a big number, and I don't know is the citation going to is the citation simply that something bad has happened, or is it that can you get away without a citation if you provided the right equipment, you provided the right training, but again the worker made an error, right?
Right. I mean, so this is a lot like Jan's question. Yeah. So the employer is the one cited, right? They are the ultimate, responsible party. So they have to provide the safe workplace. They have to provide the training. Right, so it's the employer that gets the citation. There was an interesting, if we have time later, I'll read you the text of it, but there's an interesting case where someone actually was killed applying for a tree care job, and the employer said, well, he had to show me he was competent, and of course he, so.
Did he get the job?
I figured that's just the worst job interview ever.
Worse than this.
But much worse. But so OSHA went out and still cited because you really shouldn't have people working for you who aren't working for you and trained. So, all sorts of crazy stuff happens, man. Yeah.
Not to belabor the point, but it seems to me that in terms of tree care companies that I'm familiar with, there are a handful of national firms.
Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Davy Tree, Asplund, a couple others, and then they're big and huge and have lots of resources, and then they're the little local guys that's they got one truck or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Were you able to tease
So I haven't
those
looked
out
at that.
and sort?
It can be done. I haven't looked at that yet, but actually the employer name and location is in there. So if you know the companies you're looking for and you want to identify, you can do that from the status. I haven't done it yet. Yeah, I mean you could look.
Yeah.
Right, you could look to see. We thought about looking to see if they were accredited or certified. It's complicated because you have to. We have all these years of data, and people might have become certified at some point and not, earlier, or have let their accreditation lapse or something. So that one was complicated, but certainly if you have in mind the companies, we could certainly look and see what company this happened in.
Thanks.
So I had this question, is it possible that over time OSHA was more likely to give a citation because after all more standards were passed, right? We had, of course, good old lockout, tagout standard happened in our time period. Personal protective equipment standard happened during this time period. So I wanted to see over time, comparing the cited with the non-cited cases, is there any change? It's a little hard you'd have to kind of do some math here, so I just pulled out the no citation as a percentage of the total. Actually, I mean, it's up and down, but it does look like a sort of downward trend to me. So it is possible that as more regulations became effective, OSHA had more tools at their disposal, right, for giving citations. It's easier to cite a specific standard than the general duty clause all the time. So it's possible. I do want to look at these and look at general duty clause as a percentage. I haven't done that yet, but because I'm wondering, did the specific, say the PPE standard, did that allow OSHA to cite more often, or did it just replace general duty clause citations?
Some of this could be OSHA culture,
Sure,
depending
yeah,
on
different
the
administrations here, absolutely. Budget, OSHA budget going up and down as well, so. Again, these are fatalities though, and OSHA, still goes out and investigates, right? So I think it's probably less subject to those kinds of pressures, maybe, than, just sort of routine inspections and citations, right? I mean, if the fatalities, but you're right, I mean, it may be a little less likely to cite just because of political pressures or something.
I'd just like to point out that the big dips in almost every case are election years.
Were they?
Take a look, yeah.
1990, yeah, maybe. All right, so in conclusion, overall, if you take them together, the personal protective equipment standards are most frequently cited. And electrical standards and general duty clause are really close second and third. And then we also see logging, hazard communications cited frequently. I'll just emphasize again, no citation in more than a third of incidents. So there is, I think, more work that needs to be done here to figure out why are these not being cited? And the likelihood of citation does vary by cause of death and year. So I especially want to know why, so many of the fall incidents result in no citation. So the next step really is to take a closer look at those fall incidents. And so, Jan, I would be able to go in there and look maybe a little bit more at the precipitating factors, because we have that, to see, is there a difference, did they cut the rope, or, did they simply fall, or did they fall with a tree limb that gave way? Sometimes that does happen. So I want to take a closer look at specifically the falls to see why, just about half of them result in no citation. I do want to look at the dollar amounts of those penalties to see, compare the initial penalty with the final one to see how many, how often and by how much penalties are reduced. I do want to look at the standards cited in state investigations. It's possible that in some states, because they do their own regulations, they have more specific tree care standards. There are a few states that do have a tree care standard. So I want to take a look at those. And take a closer look at some of those details about what happened in the incident. We can do some really good epidemiology with this group of reports as well. So that's really the next steps for this particular study. Looking ahead, just in the same topic of tree care safety, other things I'd like to do that I can't do with the data I have right now, things like looking at the state licensing of arborists. Right? A few states do this. What are they doing, and does it make a difference? Right? I'd love to take a closer look at that. Another thing that's just really important these days, with climate change and the crazy weather we have, tree care work after major storms is a big issue, right? Because, now you've got trees down everywhere, and you have, again, probably Renan and his wife out there with, with the chainsaw,
Probably just Renan's wife.
So, and I mean, the other thing about this is, there's potential to tap into some emergency preparedness funding to look at this, right? New Jersey is doing that. And so that's one aspect of this I'd like to look at. And essentially develop and evaluate interventions, especially for chipper and chainsaw safety, because in our earlier study that Alex published, there was, I told you it was something like 64% compliance overall, but compliance was really disappointingly low for chipper and chainsaw safety. So I think we really have work to do there in terms of developing interventions and testing them and seeing how to get people to do the safer thing there. So that concludes my talk, and I'll open it up to more general questions. Andrea? Okay. Yeah.
Oh, Billy, okay. Just looking at the data in more detail, are there variables like what type of trees are associated with more falls, or anything like what location the tree is in, if it's in an urban area or if it's in a rural setting?
That's a great question. We haven't looked at the location, but we do have the specific location. We have the zip code of where it happened. So we could look at that, and I think you're right. And these are all over the country, right? So working on a palm tree is different from working on a maple tree, right? And we know that people are suffocated when they're trying to cut palm fronds from underneath, and the fronds kind of collapse on them. And so it's different kinds of issues when you're cutting down different kinds of trees. So so it's a great question. I know Andrea had her hand.
Oh, I just was curious, so how does the proportions that you found with regard to the citations, I mean, it seems like the thought is that more citations are better. So how does those proportions that you found, are they the same or different from proportions that you would find in other industries? Do you know?
I'm not sure. I haven't looked at the other industries, so I'm not sure if it would be the same or not. Yeah, and you're right. I am making a big assumption here, right? Like, as Jan mentioned, that if there was a fatality, that there was something that you could cite, and that it might not be true in every case.
Or in other industries that may be different, I don't know.
Yeah, that
Well,
depends on the nature of the injury.
Right, and there are some industry-specific standards, because I was thinking, why all these falls not being, don't we have a fall standard? And it occurred to me, I think that's in construction. Right? I think it's falls in construction. And tree care is under general industry. Construction is a whole other industry category. So, maybe we need a fall standard for general industry and not just for construction. So that's my purpose in doing this study, was to generate just exactly those kinds of sort of things to follow up on. Do we need more standards? Because again, the thing that got me interested in this was that OSHA had kind of gone down the path of a tree care standard and then withdrew. So I wanted to see, well, did they feel they had enough tools, in their toolbox to cite what they needed to cite? And I would say probably don't, based on these findings.
So this is something, a question that I truly don't know the answer to, but I'm thinking of how residential tree work tends to be in ones and twos.
Mm-hmm.
They come to my yard and I say, that one's rotten, and get rid of that one because it's in the way of my, seeing my view. But it seems to me a lot of tree removal is associated with development. And I don't know if that's only done by bulldozers, but trees have to come down. And I'm wondering if you looked at this by location, would there be some, hint that this might be linked to basically built environment issues?
Right. Certainly could be. If only we had, I don't think there's any way to know this, how old the trees are. I mean, it's different if you're cutting down big trees,
No,
right,
really.
versus little trees. So I kind of wish we had that information. And again, we do have zip code and we have the date it happened. So we could probably, it'd be labor intensive, but we could probably piece together more of what exactly was going on there. And I should mention, I didn't mention this, almost all of these were men. I mean, there's 99% of the fatalities in this industry are men, which is why I didn't put a chart up. And almost all of these were single fatality incidents. There were maybe 4 or 5 in which two people were killed, but most of them are single fatalities.
I guess not really a question, but I really like the idea of looking at the states that both licensed arborists and maybe require a licensed arborist to be part of tree care removal. If nothing else, that might proxy for more professional organizations doing this work that are more likely to be aware of the standards, comply with the standards, not be resource limited. So you might see some interesting findings there.
Thanks, great comment, thanks.
Thanks for this presentation, Maria. I was thinking about sort of the implications of this work. I mean, as you know, NIOSH cares a lot about R2P, bringing about research to practice and translational research. Do you have a sense of the kinds of interventions that are being tested in this industry, or have you thought about, the future work you want to do, how that could lead to some intervention testing, or what's kind of happening around this industry? Do you know, or maybe it's
Well,
too soon? Or?
I can sort of guess maybe a couple of things. I mean, in terms of the licensing, again, not very many states are doing that. I imagine, again, because when you make something mandatory, it's much harder to do than something like an accreditation, that's voluntary. So, I don't know how much talk there is about expanding that, doing more of that. In terms of specific interventions. I know that from the arborist point of view, because I know this from working with Brian Kane, things that they look at are sort of tree factors, right? So knowing enough about the tree to know if this branch is going to be safe enough to get up on, and also looking at the specific things like the type of rope, and so trying to use more ropes that would be more resistant to being cut. So I think from that group, the actual industry group, there are some ideas about equipment and part of just the good tree care work, assessing the tree, because if you do have a dead branch, you don't want to obviously use that as your anchor point. So so there is some attention to safety there, but in terms of larger efforts, I'm really not sure that there are.
Yeah, I appreciate your comment about sort of understanding the tree. It'd be interesting. I could imagine some sort of tool to some screening tool, right? Like here, assess the tree before you go up on sort of something like that in practice. I wonder how much training involves getting a sense of the type of tree, quality of tree, age of tree, to know that it's a potentially unsafe workspace.
Right. I mean, especially if you're cutting down a dead tree,
Yeah.
right? I mean, if you're there to cut down a dead tree, how do you do that safely if it might have limbs that could fall?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, according to while we're throwing out all the what ifs,
Sure.
right? According to my sample of one, of having a tree cut down in my yard by brother, some brothers and brothers operation, but they were, really sanctioned business. They pushed the time of day really into dusk, and it was getting dark. And their objective was to get out of there so they didn't have to come back the next day, except to collect their equipment. Time of day might be something, even though I stood there saying, stop.
Right.
And while this was happening, a log about this big, they tie them off before they saw them,
Right.
and then they swing around.
Right.
And this was really swinging right toward the guy.
Right. So some of those struck
I
by.
was lucky that he could stop on
Yeah,
his feet.
some of those struck by incidents. That's exactly what happens, right?
Yeah.
They tie it off, then they cut it, and then it swings.
And there was haste and.
Sometimes they also then hit the ground and bounce back up and things. So again, it's so many things can go wrong here.
They use cranes too sometimes.
Oh, I hadn't seen that. Yeah, but I guess that makes sense.
They use them, they almost pick these up like toothpicks.
Oh, right, yeah.
Well, obviously, this is a topic that's generated lots of interest, questions, suggestions. We've charted your research course going forward. I want to thank Maria for a really interesting
And we have lunch on the 5th floor at 563. Everybody's welcome to join. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you all. Great questions, everyone.